At 73 years old, I sat at my own dining room table, the one Harold and I bought at an estate sale in 1987, the one where I had served 30 Thanksgivings, where I had helped 4 grandchildren with their homework, where I had cried the night my husband didn't come home from the hospital. And I watched my daughter-in-law slide a piece of paper across the polished wood toward me like she was dealing a hand of cards. "Sign it, Mom," she said, her voice bright and practiced, the way a real estate agent sounds when she wants you to feel like you have no other options. "You won't need it much longer anyway." I looked down at the paper. Then I looked up at my son, Daniel. He was staring at his plate, and something shifted inside me. Not rage. Not tears. Something quieter than that, something that had been sleeping for years, tucked beneath decades of kindness and accommodation and the particular patience that grandmothers learn to wear like a second skin. I folded my hands in my lap. I smiled. I did not sign anything, but what I discovered 3 days later changed everything. I want to tell you what kind of woman I am before I tell you what kind of woman they thought I was, because those are 2 very different things, and the distance between them is where this whole story lives. My name is Patricia Ann Mercer, and I spent 31 years teaching 7th grade English in Bloomington, Indiana. I am the kind of woman who learned every student's name by the second day of school. The kind who kept a small bowl of butterscotch candies on her desk and never once used them as a bribe. The kind who graded papers on Saturday mornings with the radio on low, a cup of Earl Grey at her elbow, and genuine hope in her heart that this would be the year Marcus finally found his voice on the page, or that quiet little Destiny would stop apologizing before every answer she gave. I retired at 62, not because I was tired of teaching, but because Harold was sick and I needed to be home. Harold Mercer. My husband of 40 years was a civil engineer who built bridges for a living and who, I always thought, was something of a bridge himself, between my stubbornness and the world, between my children and my expectations, between the woman I showed everyone and the woman who lay awake at 3 a.m. calculating how much longer we could hold everything together. Harold died on a Tuesday in November, 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. He was gone in 6 months from diagnosis, which the doctor said was fast, but which felt like the longest 6 months of my life and the shortest at the same time. We had built our home here in Carmel, Indiana, a quiet suburb north of Indianapolis, in 1991. Harold designed the layout himself, worked with the builder on every detail. The wide front porch was his idea. The kitchen window that faces east so I could watch the sun rise while I made my morning coffee. That was his gift to me, though he never said so out loud. He just had the builder angle it that way and waited to see if I noticed. I noticed on the first morning. I didn't tell him I cried. After Harold passed, our son Daniel and his wife, Renee, began coming around more. At first, I thought it was grief. I thought they were coming to check on me the way adult children do when they suddenly realize their parents are mortal. Daniel is 51 now, our middle child, and of our 3 children, he had always been the one most concerned with practical matters. Numbers, property values, what things were worth. I should have let that word, worth, sit with me a little longer than I did. Our oldest, Christine, lives in Portland with her wife and their 2 kids, and she calls every Sunday without fail. Our youngest, Thomas, is a paramedic in Louisville. He works too hard and worries about everyone except himself. But Daniel had stayed in Indiana, had stayed close. And for years, I told myself that was a blessing. Renee had married Daniel 20 years ago, and from the beginning I had understood that she was a woman who kept a careful accounting of things. Not unkind, exactly. More like precise. She cataloged the world in terms of gain and loss, and she was very skilled at making gain look like generosity. She brought me casseroles and offered to help me sort through Harold's things, and she always noticed when I mentioned what anything in the house had cost. Looking back, I can see what I could not see then. She was conducting an inventory, and I was too busy grieving to lock the door. The paper arrived at my dinner table on an ordinary Sunday evening in March. I had made pot roast, Harold's recipe, the one that requires you to sear the meat in a cast iron pan before it goes in the oven, the kind of recipe that takes all day and fills the house with something that smells like home. Daniel and Renee had come over with their 2 teenagers, Bryce and Kayla, and everything had been normal, the way things can be normal right up until they aren't. Bryce had eaten 3 helpings. Kayla had barely looked up from her phone. Daniel had talked about his company's quarterly numbers in a tone that made it sound like good news but felt like a warning. And then Renee had reached into her purse, the large leather one she carries everywhere, the one I have privately always thought was too structured for a casual Sunday dinner, and produced a folded document. She slid it across the table. "It's just a deed transfer, Mom," she said. "We've been talking to a financial planner, and honestly, with the estate tax situation and the way property values have gone up in Carmel, it just makes more sense for the house to be in Daniel's name now, while you're still here to sign. While you're still here." I looked at Daniel. He picked up his fork. "It protects you, actually," Renee continued, and her voice had that particular quality that very confident liars have. The assurance of someone who has rehearsed the explanation so many times it has started to feel true to them. If anything happens to you, it just simplifies the process. Kayla looked up from her phone for the first time all evening. She looked at me, then at her mother, then back at me. Something moved across her 15-year-old face. Discomfort, I think, the particular kind that children feel when they sense an adult is doing something wrong and don't yet have the language for it. I set down my own fork. "Let me read it," I said. Renee's smile stayed in place. "Of course." I read the document slowly, the way I had always read anything important. Harold used to say I read contracts the way surgeons wash their hands. Thorough, methodical, and you do not rush the process. The document was a quitclaim deed. If I signed it, I would be transferring full ownership of my home. This house that Harold built, that we had paid off together, that held 30 years of our life inside its walls, to Daniel. Not to both of us. Not to be held in some kind of joint trust. To Daniel alone. I refolded the paper along its original creases. "I'll need to have my attorney look at this," I said pleasantly. Renee's smile did something subtle. It stayed on her face, but something behind it shifted. "Oh, it's just a standard form, Mom. There's really nothing to—" "All the same," I said, and picked up my fork again. We finished dinner. I served the apple pie I had made from scratch that morning. I talked to Bryce about his baseball season. I asked Kayla about the school play she'd mentioned last month. I said goodnight to everyone at the door, and I hugged my son, and I watched their car back out of the driveway. Then I went to the kitchen, stood at Harold's window, and watched the dark for a long time. There was no moon that night, just the orange glow of the neighborhood lights, and the bare March trees, and the particular silence of a house that has held love and is now being asked to hold something else entirely. I didn't cry, I thought. What I did not tell Renee, what I had never seen the need to tell anyone in Daniel's household, was that my attorney was not some referral from a phone book. Margaret Hollis had been my closest friend for 44 years. We had been young teachers together, had been in each other's weddings, had sat in the same hospital waiting room when each of our husbands had their health scares. Margaret had left teaching after her first year, gone to law school at 30, and built a practice in Indianapolis that specialized in estate planning, property law, and what she privately called protecting women from people who underestimate them. I called Margaret the next morning. She came to the house that afternoon with a yellow legal pad and a thermos of green tea, and I put the document on the kitchen table between us, and she read it the way she reads everything, without expression, completely still, just her eyes moving. "Patricia," she said, when she was done. "I know," I said. "This would remove you entirely from the deed. You would have no legal claim to this property the moment you signed. I know. They could sell it. They could take out a mortgage against it. They could, theoretically, ask you to leave." I poured her more tea. "I know, Margaret." She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "You're not surprised." "I am," I said. "I'm just not shocked." "There's a difference." She nodded slowly. "Tell me everything." So I did. I told her about the last 2 years. The questions about the house's value that had seemed like casual conversation, the comments Renee had made about the upkeep being a lot for one person, the brochure that had appeared on my coffee table 6 months ago for a place called Meadow Pine Senior Living that I had not asked for and had not put there, the way Daniel had started referring to the house as the property in recent months, as though giving it a colder name might help him feel better about what he was planning to do with it. Margaret listened to all of it without interrupting. She is very good at that. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you remember what Harold did with the deed when you paid off the mortgage? He put it in the fireproof box in the closet. Have you looked at it recently?" I had not. I went and got it. We sat together at Harold's kitchen table, and Margaret laid it open, and we looked at how the property had been titled for the last 32 years. "Patricia," she said again, "yes? Harold put this in your name alone, not joint tenancy, not community property. Your name. Only." I had known that. I had forgotten that I had known that. The way you forget the location of something you've kept safe for so long, you stop needing to think about it. Harold had done it quietly, without discussion, sometime in the early 90s, when I wasn't paying attention to such things. He had told me once, years later, that he'd done it because he wanted to make sure I would always have something no one could touch. He had said it simply, matter-of-factly, the way he said most important things. I had kissed him on the cheek and promptly stored the information in the part of my memory reserved for things I trusted completely and therefore did not worry about. "So Daniel," I said slowly, "has no legal claim to this property whatsoever," Margaret said, "and if you had signed that quitclaim deed, you would have given it to him, freely, of your own apparent accord." We looked at each other. "They were counting on you not knowing," she said. "Yes," I said, "they were." Margaret pulled out her yellow legal pad. "What would you like to do?" I stood up and went to the window. The morning light was coming through the east glass the way Harold had intended it to, falling in long, pale strips across the kitchen floor. I thought about Bryce eating 3 helpings of pot roast. I thought about Kayla's face at the dinner table, that flicker of discomfort, that 15-year-old conscience making itself known. I thought about 31 years of 7th graders who had come into my classroom thinking they were invisible and left it understanding that they were not. "I'd like to be very careful," I said, "and I'd like to be very thorough, and I'd like to give them one opportunity to walk it back before I do what comes next." Margaret smiled for the first time since she'd arrived. "That sounds like you. But Margaret," I said, turning around, "if they don't take that opportunity, I need you to make sure that what I've built here cannot be touched. Not just the house. Everything." Her pen was already moving. In the days that followed, I did something that my children had always underestimated me for. I paid attention. Not in an anxious way. In the quiet, systematic way that 31 years of classroom management will teach you, if you let it. Because managing a classroom of 30 12-year-olds is, at its core, an exercise in reading the room at all times. You learn to notice the student who is working up the courage to do something impulsive. You learn to see trouble gathering at the edges of things before it arrives at the center. You learn that the loudest people in the room are almost never the most powerful. I started going through things I had been too deep in grief to examine. Harold's filing cabinet. The folder he kept in the back of the fireproof box that I had never fully sorted. And 2 days after my meeting with Margaret, on a quiet Wednesday afternoon, I found something that made me sit down on the bedroom floor and stay there for a good while. Harold had established a living trust in 2019, 6 months before his diagnosis. He had told me about it in the abstract. Had said something about making sure things are set up properly. But in those last months, I had been so consumed with doctors and medications and the particular terror of watching a strong man become fragile that I had not asked for details. I had trusted him the way I always trusted him. I had filed the information and moved on. Now I read every page. The trust held the house. It held the investment accounts Harold had quietly built over 30 years of careful engineering work. Accounts I had known existed but had not fully understood the scope of. It held a life insurance policy whose payout I had received and deposited without fully absorbing the number. And it named me as the sole trustee and sole beneficiary for the duration of my life. After my death, the assets were to be distributed equally among all 3 of my children, Christine, Daniel, and Thomas. Not to Daniel alone. Not to Renee. To all 3, equally. Harold had done it without drama, without announcement. He had simply, quietly, made sure that no one could maneuver me out of my own life. I sat on the bedroom floor with the papers in my lap and I talked to him for a while. Not out loud. Just inside, the way you talk to someone when you are past the need for words. "You knew," I told him. "You knew something like this might happen. The light came through the window the way he'd meant it to, and I took that as his answer." There was one more thing, and it was the thing that transformed my sadness into something more purposeful. Margaret called me on a Thursday evening. She had done some quiet research, the kind that good attorneys know how to do without making any noise. And she had discovered that Daniel and Renee had consulted with a real estate attorney of their own 4 months ago. They had not simply had a spontaneous idea about deed transfers over dinner. They had been planning this. They had consulted a professional, had the document drawn up, and had chosen their moment. A family dinner, a comfortable setting, a mother they expected to be trusting and perhaps a little confused about legal language. They had done the research. They had simply done it without looking closely enough at the original deed. They had assumed joint tenancy. They had assumed there was something to transfer. And in doing so, they had handed me information I would not otherwise have had. They've also, Margaret said carefully, been in contact with Meadow Pines. I set down my tea. The senior living facility? They spoke with an admissions coordinator. I can't tell you exactly what was discussed. But the contact was made, Patricia. The brochure on my coffee table. The one I had not requested. The one that had appeared there on an afternoon when Daniel and Renee had come to help clean the gutters. I understood now what it had meant. They had not been planning to ask me to sign over my home and then let me stay in it indefinitely. They had been planning a sequence of events. The deed. The sale, the placement. And perhaps, I had to be willing to think this clearly, the assumption that at 73, alone, I would not have the knowledge or the fight to stop any of it. I want to be fair when I tell you what I felt in that moment. It would be too simple to say I felt anger. What I felt was something more complicated. A grief that had nothing to do with Harold's death, a grief for the version of my son that I had raised and the version that had apparently made different choices when he thought I wasn't watching. I felt that for a long time. And then I felt clear. Clear the way cold water is clear. Clear the way the truth is clear. Once you stop letting kindness blur it. I called Margaret back. "I'm ready," I said. Easter came early that year. The second Sunday of April, still cool in the mornings, but warm enough by noon that the forsythia in my front yard had burst into yellow, and the neighbors had their windows open for the first time since October. I had always hosted Easter. It was my holiday, the way Thanksgiving was Christine's and Christmas was Thomas's. 30 years of tradition. 30 years of the good china and the lamb that takes 2 days to marinate, and the Easter egg hunt in the backyard that had started with my own children and graduated, through the years, to my grandchildren. Christine had flown in from Portland with her wife, Deborah, and their girls, Maya and Rose. Thomas had driven up from Louisville with his girlfriend, Sandra, who had never been to Easter with us before and who was, I could immediately tell, the kind of person Thomas needed. Steady, warm, and completely unimpressed by pretension. Daniel and Renee came with Bryce and Kayla. Everyone arrived within 30 minutes of each other, which was unusual. Later, I would wonder if that was fortunate or arranged. I had spent that morning in the kitchen and on the phone. Margaret was not there. I had not wanted her there. This was not a legal proceeding. This was a family. And the things that needed to be said by me, in my own house, at my own table, in the plainest possible language. The afternoon was genuinely lovely for a while. Maya and Rose found every egg. Thomas and Bryce argued good-naturedly about basketball in a way that made me remember Daniel at that age, before whatever had happened to him had happened. Christine helped me in the kitchen, and we talked about her students. She teaches elementary school now. And for a little while, I let myself just live inside the afternoon without thinking about what was coming. We sat down to dinner at 2 o'clock. I had made everything Harold loved. The lamb, the roasted potatoes with rosemary, the green beans with almonds, the dinner rolls that require 3 rises and that I have been making since 1979. Halfway through the meal, Renee said, and I believe this was intended to be a light, transitional comment. "Mom, have you had any more thoughts about that paperwork we left with you?" The table went quiet in the particular way that tables go quiet when something that was being held beneath the surface suddenly breaks through. I set down my fork, slowly. I looked around the table at my family. Christine's raised eyebrow, Thomas's sudden attention, Bryce's careful stillness, Kayla looking at her hands, Daniel not looking at me. "I have," I said. "Would you like to talk about it now?" "I'm happy to," Renee smiled. "We don't have to make it a big thing." "It is a big thing, Renee," I said, and my voice was completely calm. A quitclaim deed is a significant legal document. The transfer of a property that has been in my name alone for 32 years is a significant matter. Something shifted around the table. Christine said, "What quitclaim deed?" Thomas said, "Mom, what's going on?" Daniel finally looked up. "I want everyone to understand something," I said. And I was not speaking loudly. I was not performing. I was simply a woman at her own table telling the truth. 3 weeks ago, Renee presented me with a document that would have transferred ownership of this house, in its entirety, to Daniel. I was told it was to simplify the estate. I was told it would protect me. I looked at Daniel. I was told I wouldn't need it much longer. The silence was absolute. Even Maya and Rose seemed to sense it, stopping their quiet, whispered conversation at the far end of the table. "Mom," Daniel started. "Let me finish," I said, not harshly, just firmly. The way I used to say it in the classroom when a student interrupted because they thought they already knew what I was going to say. I did not sign the document. Instead, I had it reviewed by Margaret Hollis, who, as most of you know, has been my attorney and my friend for 44 years. I paused. What I discovered is that this house has been titled in my name alone since 1991, not joint tenancy. My name. Harold put it there deliberately, which means the only person with any legal standing to transfer it is me. Which further means that what was presented to me at this table 3 weeks ago was not a routine estate planning measure. Renee said, "Patricia, you're misrepresenting." I also discovered, I continued, that Daniel and Renee consulted with a real estate attorney 4 months ago, that the document was prepared in advance and brought to my dinner table on a Sunday when they knew I would be relaxed and well-fed and surrounded by family, and that they have been in contact with Meadow Pines Senior Living. Christine made a sound. Thomas put his hand flat on the table. "I'm not angry," I said, and this was the truest thing I had said. I want to be very clear about that. I am not saying these things in anger. I am saying them because everyone at this table deserves to know what has been happening, and because silence about things like this is how they continue to happen. Kayla was crying quietly. She was the only one at the table who was. I looked at my son. He was looking at the table, and his face had the expression of a man who had told himself a story about something for so long that he had genuinely started to believe it, and who was now being asked to look at the story from the outside. "Daniel," I said, and my voice was softer now, "I have loved you for 51 years. I carried you and I raised you, and I stayed up with you when you had nightmares, and I sat in the front row of every single thing you ever did that mattered to you. I know who you are. And I don't think the man I raised fully understood what was being planned here. I hope I'm right about that." He looked up. His eyes were wet. "But I need you to understand what would have happened if I had signed that document. I would have lost my home, the home your father built. I would have been dependent on your goodwill for a roof over my head. And based on the contact with Meadow Pines, that goodwill may not have lasted long." Renee started to speak. "I'm not finished," I said, and something in my voice closed the door on that entirely. "I also want everyone to know," I said, and now I looked around the whole table. Thomas, Christine, Deborah, Sandra, the teenagers, all of them. What Harold put in place and what I have confirmed with Margaret's help. Harold established a living trust in 2019. It holds this house and the investment accounts and the insurance policy. I am the sole trustee for the remainder of my life. Upon my death, the assets are to be distributed equally among all 3 of my children. Equally. Not just to Daniel. To Christine and Thomas as well. Christine pressed her fingers to her mouth. "I am also," I said, "in the process of establishing an educational trust for all 6 of my grandchildren. Maya, Rose, Bryce, Kayla, and any children Thomas may have in the future. Regardless of what happens between the adults in this family, those children will have what they need for their educations." Kayla looked up at me then. Her eyes were still wet, but her expression was something else. Something that looked like relief and like recognition and like the particular gratitude of a young person who has been quietly worrying about something for a long time and has just been told that someone else sees it too. "I love this family," I said. "I will always love this family. But I want to be clear. I am not confused. I am not frail. I am not a woman who signs things she doesn't understand because someone at her dinner table tells her she won't need them much longer. I am 73 years old, and I have run a classroom, and I have buried a husband, and I have held this family together through things that would have broken most people. I folded my hands on the table. Harold's table. I am not going anywhere. Not to Meadow Pines. Not to Daniel's name on a deed. Not into the category of problem to be managed. The room held its breath. But I am going to need something from this family, I said. Not apologies. Apologies are easy. I'm going to need honesty. And I'm going to need everyone at this table to decide what kind of family we are going to be going forward. Because the kind of family that does what was done these past months, I did not build that family. And I will not live inside it. I picked up my fork. I looked around the table once more. The lamb is getting cold, I said. And I made 3 rye dinner rolls, which Thomas will tell you is not a thing you waste. So let's eat. And then let's figure out who we want to be. Renee left the table before dessert. She took her purse, the large, structured one, and said she had a headache, and Daniel followed her to the front room, and the two of them had a quiet, tense conversation behind the closed French doors while Christine and Thomas and I sat in the kitchen and let the afternoon find its shape. Christine cried. Thomas did not, but he was the kind of quiet that means a great deal of processing is happening beneath the surface. Sandra cleared the dishes without being asked, which told me everything I needed to know about her. Bryce came and sat beside me at the counter, this 19-year-old boy who was suddenly looking at me the way people look at something they thought they understood and have just realized they didn't. Grandma Pat, he said, I didn't know any of that was happening. I know you didn't, sweetheart. I would have said something. I believe you, I said. And I did. Kayla came and stood next to her brother. She looked like she'd been carrying something heavy for months and had finally been told she could set it down. Mom told me the house was going to need to be dealt with, she said quietly. She said it was too much for you, that you needed care. She hesitated. I thought it seemed wrong, but I didn't. You were 15, I said. It was not your weight to carry. I put my hand over hers. It's mine, I said, and I carried it just fine. Daniel came back into the kitchen alone. Renee did not return to the table. He sat down across from me, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other, my son and I, across the distance of whatever had grown between us over the past year or two, and across the longer distance of everything that hadn't. I'm sorry, Mom, he said. It was simple. Just those 3 words. I know, I said. I told myself it was practical, that it was what was best for. Daniel. I stopped him. You don't have to explain it to me right now. I understand what happened better than you think I do. But I need you to understand something. I leaned forward slightly. Your father built this house for me, not for an estate, not as an asset. For me, and I will live in it until I decide otherwise, he nodded. His jaw worked. And if you want to be here with me, I said, if you want to bring your children to this table and eat the pot roast and watch the Easter egg hunt and be part of what your father and I built, then that door is open. It will always be open. I paused. But it is my door, I said. It has always been my door. I just forgot to say so. In the weeks that followed, Margaret finalized the living trust documentation and made sure everything was recorded properly with the county. The deed remained in my name. The trust was structured so that no single person could make unilateral decisions about the property or the assets without my consent during my lifetime. Margaret also set up the educational trust for the grandchildren with contributions that would not be affected by whatever happened between the adults. Renee did not come to the house for 6 weeks. When she finally did, she came without announcement, rang the doorbell on a Saturday morning when I was in the garden, and I let her in, and we sat at the kitchen table and we talked for 2 hours. I am not going to tell you it was easy or that everything was resolved. It was not. There are things between us that may take years and may never fully heal. But I will tell you that she said something toward the end of that conversation that surprised me. She said, I thought you didn't know what you had. I looked at her. I thought, I know this sounds terrible. I thought you didn't really understand the value of it. The house. The accounts. I thought if someone didn't take charge of it, it would just... She stopped. You thought I needed to be managed, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Yes. Renee, I said carefully. I taught school for 31 years. I balanced a household budget and raised 3 children and helped Harold build everything we had from 1 modest engineer's salary and 1 teacher's paycheck. I read my husband's trust documents. I hired my own attorney. I knew what I had. I folded my hands on the table. I just didn't feel the need to announce it. She looked out the kitchen window for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I guess you didn't. It is late May now, and the forsythia has been replaced by the roses Harold planted along the fence, the ones that bloom pink in spring and deep red by summer. I drink my coffee at the east window every morning, and the light comes in the way he meant it to, and I think about what it means to be still standing in a place that was built for you by someone who loved you. I think about the students I taught who came from homes where they were underestimated, who learned over the course of one school year that their voices deserved space. I think about Harold, who never made grand speeches about protecting me, but simply, quietly, put my name on things. I think about Kayla, who came to me last week and asked if she could talk, who sat in my kitchen and told me she wants to be a lawyer, who said, "And this is the thing I will carry for the rest of my life. Grandma Pat, I saw what you did. I want to do that." Not the drama part. The part where you already knew everything and you just waited for the right moment. I looked at this 15-year-old girl, this child of a woman who had tried to take my house, and I thought about how the best thing that can come from being underestimated is the moment you watch someone younger understand that they don't have to be. That's the whole skill, I told her, knowing things and choosing your moment. She nodded like she was filing it away. "I think she will be just fine. People ask me sometimes. Or they would if they knew the whole story. How I stayed so calm through all of it. How I sat at that Easter table and said what I said without raising my voice or dissolving or falling into the kind of despair that this kind of betrayal can cause. I'll tell you the honest answer. I didn't stay calm because I wasn't hurt. I stayed calm because Harold had given me something more valuable than a name on a deed. He had given me 40 years of a man who took me seriously, and that kind of love leaves a residue. It teaches you what it feels like to be seen. And once you know what it feels like to be seen, you become very, very clear when someone is trying to make you invisible. I was not invisible. I had never been invisible. I had simply been quiet. And there is a world of difference. The quiet ones don't disappear. They watch. They learn. They keep the important papers in fireproof boxes, and they read every document before they sign it, and they have 44-year friendships with women who went to law school. And when the moment comes, the dinner table, the sliding document, the words you won't need it much longer, they look up, they fold their hands, and they say, "Let me read it first. Quiet people don't explode. We clarify."